Well, good afternoon and welcome back to our mid-afternoon session in the EdTech and Education stream or stage. So thank you for joining us. Got a great session coming up, which I think is a question that many people have been talking about and thinking about over the period, which is that EdTech companies, both big and small, have, I guess, subject to some of the things that have happened in the COVID crisis, have seen numbers skyrocketing. But the question really, and one of the things we'll debate as part of this, is the genuine motivation for those to help and teach and, teach and learning, basically, to really work through the process. So we've got a bunch of experts here who are really engaged in this area, and I think we'll want to investigate this matter further, because I think it's always been a question about how much we want business and education to be involved in the classroom, but where does that boundary sit? Now, the great thing about this, we're curated by DebateMate, and we've actually got a fabulous chairman for this particular session, which is Dex Hunter-Torricke, and Dex is head of communications for the Oversight board, which of course is a body established in 2020, which is making decisions on Facebook and Instagram's most sort of challenging content issues. But Dex has also got a great career in companies like SpaceX, Facebook, Google, etc. So Dex, I'm going to hand over to you to introduce your panel and have a great debate.
Thanks a lot, Phil. And hi, everyone. Glad you could join here, and welcome to the debate. Today's debate, as Phil mentioned, is curated by DebateMate, which is a global social business with a mission to drive social change through opening up access to communication training, through teaching debating, leadership, critical and creative thinking, and other incredibly valuable skills. And they've worked with over 100,000 young people in 50 countries so far, and they've partnered with companies from McKinsey to Morgan Stanley and a lot of other companies, presumably not beginning with M. So pretty amazing. Today, we'll be having a debate with four fantastic speakers who I'll introduce in a moment. They will be debating this motion. This House believes that big tech should stay out of the classroom. The speakers will each have 3 minutes to make their case. We'll hear from the first four speakers before breaking to ask and accept questions for about 10 minutes, which the panelists will be invited to respond to fairly briefly. We will then close with the students' view, provided by another excellent debater. And incredibly, yes, we are actually having a real student who's going to be joining this debate about education. So a nice treat. So let's go ahead and meet our debaters. So speaking for the motion, we will be having Elyas Felfoul. Elyas is a director at WISE, the QATAR Foundation's World Innovation Summit for Education. Also speaking for the motion is Harish Natarajan, who is head of economic risk at AKE International and a board member at Polemix. Harish is one of the most successful competitive debaters of all time and recently defeated IBM's Project Debater in the first public debate between a human and AI. And Harish not only kicked the AI's ass, he now wants to kick it out of the classroom just to really humiliate it. Speaking against the motion, Ben Nelson. Ben is Chancellor of Minerva University, which is based in San Francisco, and founder and CEO of the Minerva project, which is focused on reinventing higher education. And Scarlett McCabe. Scarlett is the co-founder and CEO of DebateMate Limited, the business side of DebateMate and DebateMate Online, the virtual debate club program for young people across the world. And before founding DebateMate, Scarlett studied at the London School of Economics and represented the school at the World University's Debating Championships. And lastly, but definitely not least, our student summarizer will be Holly Agbukor. Holly is a year 13 student at Sacred Heart School in Camberwell, London. And she's been part of DebateMate for 6 years now. And from October, she'll be studying PPE at the University of Oxford. And many congrats to Holly. So with that introduction, I'm going to invite Elyas to kick off with speaking for the motion, and we will alternate between the two teams as we work through this. Elyas, you have 3 minutes.
Thank you very much, Dex, and glad to be part of this group today. I'm going to jump straight in. It's very difficult to be in this debate because we have to choose against or for such a big question. However, if I have to start, I'll say technology has been recently associated as the key to improving education. Now, that won't happen as long as our use of technology is based on mistaken beliefs about how people learn. I want to make a quick distinction before going and debate for a big tech stay out of the classroom. We're talking here about big tech, not small tech, not any tech. We're really talking about big tech. And here, the big tech, we're probably looking at the club of 4 or 5 that Senator Elizabeth Warren have been recently enjoying her moment by putting some bills to regulate that market. So why am I for big tech staying out of the classroom? Number one, I think despite increased tech in classrooms, test scores have continued to stagnate or decline despite predictions that technology would revolutionize education. It is basically what we observe is tech is mostly just replicating some existing and effectual approaches to teaching, and sometimes making them worse. By big tech involvement does not replace a good pedagogy. Current tech is largely mismatched with student teachers' need, and big tech will likely be even more removed from the realities of everyday schools. Before we can harness the power of technology to improve learning, we have to first understand how learning works. And that means reversing mistaken assumptions that have been entrenched for decades. Number two, in my view, is personalized learning through technology doesn't work. Students who aren't already competent in a field are ill-equipped to direct their own learning. Big tech will certainly help accelerate the skills and competencies of those who are already digitally literate and adapt to online learning. However, for the most majority of the world population, digital literacy is not always a given. Therefore, the increased presence of big tech within schools threaten to further widen the equity gap in education rather than help those most in need to bridge it. Number three, and I'll stop here, big tech try to insert their influence as early as possible. K-12, we all know, is not a big money maker, but it is a big branding opportunity. It's really access to a relationship with a customer that has a much greater lifetime value for them than their time in school. This is completely unethical in what should drive schools and university. These learning environments should not become branding opportunities, and students should not groom to become future consumers.
Great. Thanks, Elyas. Speaking against the motion now, Ben Nelson.
Thanks so much for having me. And I wanted to pick up where Elyas dropped off, actually where he started his point as well, which is let's actually unpack what it is that we're debating. Because clearly, we're not talking about private corporations or for-profit corporations playing a role in education, because they've been doing that since the beginning. Textbook manufacturers, test providers, some of which are nonprofit, some of which are for-profit, but the nonprofits act like for-profits, cafeteria providers, the kinds of food that is available at schools, uniforms, class rings in the United States, and other commercial interests pervade the secondary and post-secondary markets, as well as elementary school markets, all over the world. So clearly, this isn't a conversation about small tech or for-profit companies. Now let's talk about small tech. Well, it's kind of hard to argue about small tech as well. I mean, we've been using technology in classrooms since I was in elementary school, certainly before that as well. And so you have educational games that have been used, use all sorts of technology in their day-to-day world. So then, and of course, let's not forget that we're still in a pandemic where one could argue small or big tech, depending on how you define it, which we'll get to that in a second, basically enabled education to occur, right? And now then there's a question of what is big tech? And are we really talking about 3 or 4 companies? Or are we talking about largely capitalized companies? So as an example, is Zoom small tech or big tech? A little bit hard to argue that a company that has a market capitalization approaching $100 billion that had a market share approaching 100% would be small tech. Are we suggesting that video conferencing should be banned from the classroom? Are we suggesting that we should reject the use of technology when it's necessary? And then let's not forget some of the biggest big tech names, such as Apple or Google. They provide the devices that have been used in schools, certainly in Apple's case, for nearly 40 years. And so the question really is, why are we thinking about banning big tech? And to me, it appears that there is a perspective that big tech somehow has some nefarious goals that middle-sized tech, small tech, publishing companies, food providers, and any other commercial interests somehow don't have. And I don't believe there's any evidence to that effect.
Great. Thanks, Ben. And speaking again for the motion is Harish.
Well, thank you. So I guess I want to start with what Ben asked, which is the difference really between big tech and small tech or other kinds of for-profit companies. I think it's probably worth just being clear about what we mean here. I don't think any of us mean you can't have a tablet in the classroom, that you won't have some computers or laptops or Windows out there, or people won't use Google. I don't think that's really what we're talking about here. I think it probably is when people use Google Classroom, which has become increasingly dominant, when you have more and more subsidized Chromebooks or iPods in the classroom. And here it's important to see what is the big difference with big tech and small tech. And I think that can be multiple, but I want to focus on a couple of them. The first is, if you ask me what the feature of big tech is, it isn't market capitalization. I think it's fair to say there are lots of companies, particularly after the last year, which are traditionally small tech but have massive market capitalization. I think it's actually more that they have major market share in a range of different sectors. So if you think about Google, education's a tiny part of its overall business, but it has 15 other multi-billion-dollar segments to it. And the reason I want to focus on that is twofold. Because I think that creates two problems when it comes to big tech. The first is to understand the financial model here. There may, of course, be some altruistic purposes behind what Google does, behind what Apple does, Microsoft, Amazon. But I don't think that's the main part here. I think the main reason why they get into the classroom is this is a $250 billion in the United States alone industry. But the way they're able to be more profitable than a small tech company is partially through cross-subsidization. And then using the reason why you cross-subsidize is because you get loyal customers, as we've heard about before, but also because you can create convenient operability. That doesn't mean that you can't use some of the Google products on anything else, but it's much more convenient to use a Google product on a Google device. I think that's actually the way lots of these markets work, that a government which doesn't want to spend a lot of money, school districts which don't want to spend a lot of money, go for the cheaper product, but find themselves 2-3 years in, now in an ecosystem which costs them more and more money. That I think is one problem. The other one relates to its relationship with small tech. Bear in mind that we do need to find the best ways of teaching students, the best ways of adapting to their needs, and that may not be the educational models we have thus far. I think we've talked about that in the first speech. I would add, there are also new challenges about the reality of the digital divide, even in the most developed countries, what actually ends up working. But the difficulty is small tech really struggles where big tech is dominant, in part because you just can't really easily have a reasonably high market share when you're competing against Google, against Microsoft, against the Facebooks to some degree of this world. So what I think big tech does then is it can be very dominant because it can be very price efficient in the short term. It can do that because it sells more products to schools in the medium term and to children who become consumers in the long term. And in doing so, actually gives us very little space for small tech. And that is dangerous, given just how much we still need to learn about the sector.
Great, fantastic. And rebutting that will be Scarlett.
Thank you, Dex, and I'm really honoured to be here today. Thank you so much, everyone, for tuning in. Harish just did a very classic debater move. Harish reframed the entire debate to be big tech versus small tech, when actually what we're talking about is the principle of technology. So I'm going to reframe it back, Harish, and I'm going to talk today about why it is especially big tech that needs to be in the classroom to allow us to use technology in the most efficient and effective way, to allow us to teach more people more inclusively and to achieve greater ends. So I'm going to talk about two things today. The first thing I'm going to talk about is exactly why it is big tech specifically that needs to be in the classroom, not small tech or any tech, specifically big tech. And second of all, I'm going to talk about why big tech or any tech allows teachers to do what only teachers can do best, which is be human and teach. So my first argument is about how big tech is precisely the mammoth beast that needs to be in the classroom, because we need to have everyone using it. We need to have the most sophisticated AI and machine learning programs out there. We need to have the most accessible options out there. We need a big company like Google, like Apple, that can fund billions into education systems and provide free or discounted devices so that children across the world can use them, because we need everyone to use them. Only once everyone is using these devices, only once everyone is engaging in the principle of technology in the classroom, are we able to properly educate people on the right way to use it. The problem is, at the moment, AI, machine learning and technology is still very elitist in every sense of the word. It's still very much kept to a certain percentage of the education system and to schooling. And I think that the current pandemic has really demonstrated that in the UK, in the US, and elsewhere in the world. Inaccessibility of devices and connectivity has meant that those in some of the poorest communities across the world have really struggled to engage with tech. So we do need these big companies to be doing it, because only once everyone can engage in technology, only once everyone can understand the output of the algorithm, rather than just the algorithm itself, can we really make sure that education is monitored and put forward in an ethical, in an accessible, and ultimately in an effective way. Professor Rose Luckin from the Institute of Education has spent her life researching the impact of AI in education, and is one of the leading members of the AI Select Committee in terms of looking at ethical AI in education. And she says it's absolutely required that we have critical mass. We need to have everyone using it so people can really understand the dangers of it. But second of all, even if everyone's not using it, we should be promoting AI and machine learning through big tech in the classroom, because it allows teachers to do what only teachers can do best. If you can use Alexa to really understand the class dynamics in a class sort of 30, 35 students, as a teacher, it's so hard to understand how different children are interacting. It's really hard to know if one particular child is consistently being shouted over or isn't able to engage. Whereas if you have Alexa, if you have various different devices which can monitor student participation in the class, then you're actually, a teacher can see, okay, well, this particular percentage of the class, either in person or virtually, isn't engaging as much, and I have the data to prove that, so I need to focus my attention on them. We're not suggesting we're not suggesting that Google or Apple come in and create robot teachers that can teach children and we don't need teachers in the classroom. We absolutely do. But the principle is that big tech, and only big tech at the moment, allows teachers to do what only teachers can do best, which is teach and inspire children. That is why I absolutely oppose this motion. Thank you.
Thanks, Scarlett. No robot teachers immediately. Let's open it up to the debate, to the conversation and the questions. So if you have a question, please go ahead and ask it, and our moderator will pop that into here so we can throw that at the panel. I will kick off with a question then, using a point Scarlett just made. So Scarlett talked about the need to have the most accessible tools, and about how currently it is big tech that is making those tools that obviously millions and billions of people around the world know how to use. I'm going to go back to Elyas, who spoke first. Elyas, how do you respond to that? Shouldn't we want to put the tools that people know how to use into the hands of kids and students?
Look, if this could lead to a democratizing the education experience through a partnership that is well frameworked between big tech and, let's say, for the sake of this debate, local colleges, sure. But this partnership should be well framed, and it should come to really kind of go beyond just product and software. It should be a way to help the curation of the courses, to help increase the number of students worldwide, and so on.
Well, I'm going to pose this question to the other team. Ben, Elyas has thrown out an option there of well-crafted partnerships. Big tech has a record of dominating the industry and dictating terms to a lot of folks. I mean, there's a huge antitrust push underway on both sides of the Atlantic right now. How can we trust big tech to craft well-thought-through partnerships that treat educators and educational institutions fairly?
Well, I think by the evidence, which is that big tech turns out doesn't dominate in education at all. Again, just look at the past pandemic. Google has a product, Google Classroom, Google Meet, Google Hangout, that they've been working on for a decade plus. Yet when the pandemic hit, who won the market? Not Google Meet, not even close. It was Zoom, right? Because it was, to Harish's point, not a multi-headed organization. It had a better product and it won in the marketplace. Relatively simple. If big tech has a better product, it will win. It will engage school districts, it will engage universities, it will engage countries that will create structured relationships that provide a better support structure for students. But the idea that somehow there's something inherent in big technology that doesn't allow that to happen, and again, our opponents have even acknowledged this. Well-regulated contracts generally occur in education. We say, oh yeah, of course, well, we want to ban big tech, but not when it comes to tablets or PCs. Obviously, we need those. And oh yeah, I mean, I guess, all of the other products and services that are already in the classroom, yeah, we don't want to stop that. And so the real question is probably not how do we not welcome big tech, but just how do we ensure that any vendor, whether they're big or large, don't take advantage of an educational institution? And I think on that's a relatively non-controversial point of view that I believe Scarlett and I very much agree with.
When I was at Google, I remember somebody said, name a more iconic duo than Google and terrible messaging services. And it was a slightly hard point to rebut. Harish, you made a point about how companies want to get into a $200 billion market, for education. Isn't it okay that companies want to make a profit? What's the deal there?
Oh, it's absolutely fine. Companies want to make a profit. The real question, though, isn't whether they want to make a profit, and in some cases, their products are indispensable. It's how do they do so, and how does that actually interact with the reality of government and school funding? And I think one of the advantages big tech has, and I think it is true, it doesn't have data messaging. In some cases, your products just aren't as good as smaller companies. One way you are going to be doing that is by cutting your prices because you can sell more in future. And what we'll see from school districts, I think we're already seeing that, is buying some of your cheaper products now, even if it creates a financial liability in future. And I think in part, when you look at big tech, it is, here is a customer base which will be useful in 20 years as well. And I think in some ways we understate those hidden costs, which is somewhat unique to big tech. So it's obviously fine to make a profit, but I think in some ways with big tech, it's actually less transparent how they make a profit through some of these services.
I thought it was interesting you mentioned hidden costs, because there's another element which I didn't hear mentioned very much in the remarks, which is around just how effective technology is in the classroom. Actually whether it is big tech or small tech. And Elyas, you did make the point that the record on personalized tech is slightly checkered. Scarlett, what do you make of the suggestion, by a lot of folks who have concerns about kids being, overly exposed to technology and actually tech tools supplanting just good quality teaching and curricula?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And there's a lot of absolute rubbish out there that costs a lot of money and that no one knows how to use. And I think that is a problem. But as Elyas said at the beginning, the issue isn't necessarily, and this is ironic that we are on different sides of the debate and yet agreeing, issue isn't necessarily the tech itself. It's how the tech is applied to the learning. And actually, it's the other way around. You need to have solid pedagogy, solid learning science before you can then think about the data science and the technology that sits on top of that. I think education generally has often got quite complicated. We at Debate believe very strongly that it's not actually that complicated. It is quite simple. And a lot of it involves teaching skills rather than necessarily focusing on the knowledge. And I think there is technology out there that can do that. So the issue, to summarize, Dex, the issue isn't necessarily the technology itself. It's the fact that the technology in education has forgotten the education part, but that doesn't mean it can't get it. And there's a lot of incredible programs out there. A lot of universities and academic institutions are really pushing the kind of research and pedagogical side of EdTech. So putting the ed back in EdTech rather than just focusing on the tech.
Excellent soundbite as well. Elyas, given you mentioned that personalized tech doesn't really work, isn't it most likely that it's going to be big tech that is able to commit the resources and the engineering expertise and so on to actually make it something more valuable and to actually perfect some of the things like machine learning and AI, that could be transformative for teachers?
I'm going to divert a little bit to answer the question. I'm going to bring it back to the funding. You know how they can contribute right now to schools? By funding them. The solution are within the teachers, but there is a huge shortages right now in budget cuts and so on. So if big tech want to contribute to this genuinely, let them fund the school, let them help the district, and let them not do this from a business perspective. Let them do this from a perspective of giving back to the society, because it's not normal the way they got this much money. So there is something that they need to give back. And I think they should pay, contribute to the society through rethinking how we could reinvest in our education. And they can play a role from that perspective.
Ben, you run a university. Should big tech be funding you?
Yeah, I mean, without big tech funding, our university wouldn't exist. So not only in the underlying infrastructure that we use to educate our students in a vastly superior way to those institutions that use less technology in their education, but also if you look at those who donate money to enable our school to be the most socioeconomically diverse university of any highly selective university in the Western world, 100% of our donors made their money in technology, and some in very, very big tech. And so there's no question that the positive role of those individuals who have benefited, and those corporations who've benefited, once directed, can be done well. But I think there's another fascinating perspective on this, which is, though our technology is, of course, provided by Minerva itself, by the Minerva project, which is very much small tech, without big tech, we wouldn't be able to exist, because we build our entire technology stack on Amazon Web Services. And if it wasn't for Amazon AWS, which pretty much hosts, between whether it be Amazon or Google or any other Microsoft cloud, they're all the major cloud companies are all gigantic organizations. We don't even know that small tech relies on big tech to exist. And so one way or another, you want to be able to bring down the costs of technology, and big tech has to play a role in doing that.
Well, Ben makes a good point I'm going to pose to Harish, which is, there is a slightly fuzzy line between big and small tech. Often it's big tech that is helping grow small tech. Small tech, when it's successful, might become big tech. And of course, we've got the example there of Zoom, $100 billion company. Harish, is Zoom okay to use? At what point do companies get too big where you've got to kick them out of the classroom?
Right. So I don't think we can think about this in terms of market cap. And indeed, if you have an EdTech company which becomes worth $100 billion and maybe diversifies into another areas, I think it's in a sense a slightly different question. as to at what point can that actually be an issue. I think the issue isn't so much the size. The issue is, why are you in the sector and how are you actually making money from it? I think that's more of the question to ask. I think almost just pushing that even a little bit further when we think about the real power of big tech is what I think everyone's mentioning, which is if we do need revolutions in artificial intelligence and research, big tech is obviously the place where that's most likely to occur. But one worry I have is, we've all said we want education to be ahead of technology. We need the educational research before we have the technology in place. That sounds wonderful, but does that actually happen? Once you have the technology in the classroom, isn't that the strong temptation almost just to do it the other way around? What can we do to change our teaching methods based on the technology we have available? And in some ways, this is speaking, I guess, to a bigger problem with technology in the classroom overall. But if we don't have that foundation, that becomes a fairly large concern that will teach to technology rather than use technology in a way which is good for us. And in some ways, that's an even bigger issue, partially because the virtues of big tech and just how powerful it can be and how useful it can be and even how user-friendly it can be and how difficult it can be to challenge once it's dominant.
Scarlett, how do you respond to that?
I mean, look, I think a lot of what Harish said is accurate, and I think there's a lot of credence in that. I mean, I think the main issue that we've got and that we've got to really address is, which we haven't necessarily talked about, but has come out kind of implicitly, is the kind of ethical implications. And when we're talking about something as serious as education and educating young people, the ethical implications of whatever thing that goes in the classroom is paramount. So my kind of closing thoughts on this, I guess, are, and my call to action for everyone is really just look at sort of the principles behind the technology that's in the classroom, whether it's big or small, medium-sized, non-existent. It needs to have a really inclusive, fair, just, equal process that's gone into creating it so that it's inclusive for everyone, but also allows kind of educational standards to be met and continue to improve. So I guess not to hoodwink that question, but I think that's probably my final thoughts on it all.
Well, Scarlett, just before you get off the hook, I'll ask you for another final thought. So you mentioned the ethical dimension, and obviously big tech has had a terrible few years. It's been attacked by regulators and policymakers. There's millions of people who really distrust big tech and their record on managing data. And they would say, if you look at the underlying principles, there's actually a lot of companies who are more motivated by trying to extract data and building extractive businesses. How do you think you can get people to trust in big tech, to provide services in the classroom with, some of the most vulnerable, folks in society who, we've got to look out for?
That's a really good question and a very interesting one posed by you, because I think the reality is the bigger the beast, the bigger the scrutiny, and the more that people can actually see what they're doing. Back to my point that I made in the debate, I think that big tech has a lot going for it in that it can be everywhere and that it can provide opportunities that smaller companies can't. But it also means that people can hold them to account and can hold companies and their practices and how they're using our data. So I think it's a call for regulation. It's a call for oversight boards. It's a call for whatever it is, but it's a way of holding that mirror up. And tech, whether it's big or small, is just the reality now in the classroom. And I think the bigger the company is, the more we can hold them to account and ensure that actually they are doing things properly. The danger is when those small things that drip through, that don't necessarily have the same regulation, that don't necessarily have the same standards to uphold. I think that's really dangerous. So I think the principle still applies. And if anything, in a way, although the implications of big tech doing it wrong are huge because they're bigger and they're everywhere, I also think the opportunity to regulate, the opportunity to monitor is greater when it comes to big tech. So I still stand by that.
Right. So potentially big tech in the classroom, but heavily regulated and with very careful partnerships watched over by watchdogs. So Holly is going to give us the students' view and tell us where all of these fantastic debaters are wrong and where they're right. Holly.
Thank you so much for such a fascinating debate. I think one thing that it's definitely uncovered is that there are so many different facets and things that this sort of debate trickles into. So, you know, it's a very complex issue, and I'm privileged today to be able to speak for students and discuss the topic and arguments that we've heard here today. So the first thing I'd like to say is that technology must absolutely be perceived with caution. I think Scarlett has just touched on it, that technology does have a reputation of not always being trustworthy for a lot of people, and therefore we must always perceive it with caution. As a student myself who has studied through national lockdowns, and I now have a much stronger grasp on how technology works hand in hand with education. And therefore, I must say that I doubt technology will ever be able to fully compensate for the in-person traditional classroom learning experience. Having said that, I can't deny its value, because what big technology in particular does is it equips students with the necessary tools and technological know-how, which is increasingly utilized in the workplace. And what would the potential consequences be if students missed out on this exposure? If the purpose of schools is to sufficiently prepare students for the working place, for the working world, then failure to expose them to big technology could be considered a great disservice to students everywhere. And Scarlett gave an important point about resources, and that one of the greatest advantages of big technology is that they have the resources, but we have to recognize that providing technology in schools is an investment into the future. It's inserting influence as early on as possible and becoming ingrained into students' lives, which is something that we have to be cautious about and understand the risks of. Many argue that these profits aren't what's important, and really it's more from the heart. But I question, how exactly do we measure the intentions of companies, especially big companies that we have come to be a bit more distrustful of in recent times? What if it's all just a big public relations push, or a way to, if thinking cynically, even indoctrinate future generations into thinking a certain way or perceiving information in a certain way? There is a concerning degree of influence, and what big tech companies could be trying to do is gain a foothold in the next generation and getting students accustomed to certain products, so that in the long term they adopt these products and these interfaces in their later lives, which could potentially widen the inequality gap, as Elyas said earlier. Ultimately, I do believe that big tech is at the forefront of global innovation and development, and it's not going anywhere. That's the truth of it, and we can't ignore it, we can't suppress it. So it is worthwhile to embrace big technology and, as much as possible, use it to our advantage, allow students to best understand technology and innovate, so that as future generations we can provide solutions to a lot of issues that are happening in the world. I think the beauty of debating is that there is no definitive answer a lot of the time. And so I'm happy to leave it to you at home or at work or wherever you may be to really consider what we've learned today and decide whether or not the risks are worth the reward when it comes to big tech.
Holly, thank you so much. A very balanced, nuanced, thoughtful view, showing, of course, why Holly is heading off to do PPE at Oxford later this year. So a word of caution and a word of optimism. Tech as an investment in the future, but one that is being driven by a set of folks who may have other motives, and of course, recalling the importance of watching very closely about how those companies may want to operate inside and outside the classroom. I want to thank our amazing set of panelists, Elyas, Harish, Scarlett, Ben, and Holly, for taking the time to talk about this very important topic. I'm sure we could keep going for a long time. But thank you everyone for joining, and very much look forward to continuing the discussion online. And thanks a lot.
Thank you, Dex. And thank you all of the panel. I think it's summed up beautifully by Holly at the end, saying that there's no definitive answer here, but I think some very strong arguments in both directions, both for and against tech in general and big tech in particular in the classroom. But thank you so much for that rich debate. I'm sure there will be a lot of discussion outside of this. We've had a lot of these discussions already during the day, and we have another session before we close today. But thanks very much to all the panelists. We'll close the session now.